You never know when cheating might happen in your life. In my case, I never would have guessed that it would happen right outside our house at the bus stop where I happened to walk in. But what I saw left me shocked and made me think about how well I know my wife. You definitely don't want to miss this story. I was 25 years old at the time, and so was this woman. However, her 25 turned out to be quite different from mine. She had been divorced and had a young son by the time she was 25. On the other hand, I had only owned a car at that age. Anyway, I'll quickly rewind and say that we started dating. I was drawn to her mature and measured attitude towards life. Going out to nightclubs and such didn't interest her. She had a good job, kept her home in order, and took care of her baby. I must admit, I suddenly wanted that kind of stability in my life. I wanted to be responsible and be a decent person. But, as I later realized, it was after these thoughts that I was almost taken advantage of. "Why don't you stay with us?" Tanya asked one evening when I visited them, and that was my first mistake, going to my friend's place instead of taking her to mine. And then without even realizing it, I ended up living with her. Her house had more rooms and was closer to the daycare for her baby. Plus, she had been going to the same gym near her house for years. So I moved out, and from then on, the dynamic shifted from being loving and affectionate to one with more questions and demands. It had been almost 6 months since we met, and by then, I was already acting like a husband. I did all sorts of little things around the house, took time off work to help with the baby, and paid for everything. But in the midst of all this, I completely forgot to ask her about her first husband. "So where is your ex-husband now?" I finally asked. Of course, she had mentioned him briefly when we first met, but she seemed to prefer talking about our relationship rather than her past. But no matter how much I tried to avoid it, the truth eventually came out. And a series of events still forced me to eventually get away from this Taishiana. So once she and I started talking about the gym, to which she goes with regularity, for several months. "It's far away," I asked her. "Should I also start getting ready for spring? As long as it's fall here, and then winter, just in time for summer to get myself back in shape. Give me the address." And it turned out that there is no gym near our house, and she hasn't been going to one in recent weeks. "So why did you tell me you've been working out for a long time?" I asked her. "I wanted to impress you, as if men don't do that. I see no gym," and then more. Then the first fight ensued when I apparently asked her a question out of rank. Well, even funnier was her response. "She has a smart home system at home. Well, you can control the appliances through your cell phone." I picked up my phone and it was out of juice. I quickly turned on the device I needed and quickly put my mobile on the charger. Now the device had to be turned off. I took Taishiana's iPhone and there was a password. Another second, she comes into the room, she saw a cell phone in my hands, and, almost piggyback squealing, grabbed the phone and snatched it, almost dropping it on the floor. "Tani, you're normal. What do you keep there that's so important that it's worth protecting?" "It's my space. It's mine and that's it." She left for the kitchen and I noted this prank inside me. About 15 minutes later, she came back and handed me her cell phone. No offense, it's just the way I was brought up. She told me through her teeth, but of course that excuse was not enough for me. Her cell phone that I did not take, and this case for myself, remembered. And it turned out that, not for nothing. In the meantime, as I said, autumn has come, and the next call for me was the rainy weather. My schedule at work is irregular. I can leave in the morning much earlier than her. I can leave later and the same in the evening. I can be home at 3 o'clock, and sometimes I can only get to bed by midnight. On one such day, I called the future wife of the unsuccessful Taishiana and quickly took the child from kindergarten at 4 and was with him at home. It was raining outside, and we were expecting Taishiana home at about 6. When that time came, Taishiana came home. We met her. I took her bags from the doorstep. I looked and there was hardly a drop on her square. "Do you take a cab there or what?" I asked her. "The bus. What do I need a cab for?" I looked at the umbrella hanging in the check room. It was in its case, and of course, dry. If it hadn't been for that incident with the phone, I wouldn't have paid any attention to the rain or the umbrella. But in our case, I did pay attention. Never mind, never mind. A few more weeks go by, she comes home dry again. Tanya, I'm not hinting at anything. Let you better tell me how this can be and all. She laughs. The bus, my dear fellow, can stop not only at bus stops but also on demand, not far from our doorstep. I just walked from our bus stop, but I asked and the driver stopped right there. We really lived near the terminus of one of the city buses, and apparently since this area and town was still new, indeed one of the stops was quite far away, and the next stop was already the terminus. But the fact that the big buses here, like cabs, would drop off and pick up anyone on the way, well, something was wrong somehow. But it's not like being caught and being a thief, but only until caught. And I did catch her in the end. In general, one day I arrived home at night. Of course, there was no free parking at that time. And it wasn't just by the house. There was none in sight of the human eye. I spent half an hour near the yard, just bumping into the curb in hopes of finding a spot. The closest place for the car turned out to be almost at the bus terminus. I couldn't see it from our window, and I certainly wouldn't have left the car there at any other time. But there wasn't much to choose from that day. I parked there, closed the car, and headed off to the side. The next day, I was supposed to be home all day. The baby stayed with me that day too. And in the evening, I remembered, damn, I have my car parked there, God knows where. Then, like fate, a free space opened up under the window. In general, I started to gather my things, and the child asked to go with me. Let's go, I said, taking him with me. I grabbed the keys to the car, and we went to the terminal to move my car closer. I started the car, warmed it up, and began to pull out onto the road to turn around. And there was a marking for 2 solid lanes. The nearest U-turn was at the bus terminus, but it was only a 20-second drive. Without a second thought, I got on the road, reached the terminal, turned around, and saw the driver get out of the bus, which was standing at the bus stop with some things in his hands, and go to the cabins where the drivers were sitting. I got out of the car, took my son by the hand, and we walked towards the door of the bus. As we approached, we looked inside and saw my wife sitting on the driver's lap. The child I was leading by the hand broke free and ran inside with a yell of "Daddy!" So I stood there wondering what to do. Everyone was silent, and everyone, as I understood it, was waiting for me to make a move. It is clear. Our daddy is the driver of one of those buses. Now, I know what kind of driver he is, who almost every day breaks the bus in front of the door. But most of all, I was struck by the reaction, or rather the lack of it. I actually asked her if she was ashamed. She said that he was her ex-husband, and that the fate of this apartment and more depended on him. I quickly drove to her apartment and started packing, and then she finally opened up. As it turned out, everything with Abba's signature for her is nothing, and she thinks the relationship can only start in a registry office. The fact that I invested completely in the family and in this place, the fact that I almost changed my whole life for her benefit, it all does not matter, and without guarantees, as she put it, that is, without a stamp in the passport, she can do whatever she wants. And certainly, as she put it, with the birth father of her child. In short, such an inadequate experience is enough to last me a lifetime. And now I'm sitting here thinking, what if we had lived at my place? And the end of this, I never would have shown up. How many months, or maybe years, to figure out all of her fun, she certainly would not have told me, because for her it is normal. Second story, did you ever feel like there was something wrong with your marriage? I too thought we were doing fine until one day, something happened that shattered my faith in our married life. I accidentally discovered my wife cheating on me, and it shook me to my core. But what happened next surprised even me. Do you want to know how I solved this situation and how my wife regretted her actions? Then stay with me for the rest of this video. I will omit how my wife and I once met. It doesn't have much relevance to my story, which by all appearances will be quite long. I suggest listening to the whole story, as it were, to get a sense of what I felt during those months, as they say, firsthand. Marina and I, in our late 30s, decided to move to a bigger city after we got married. This decision, of course, was not easy for us. The thing is that, in our hometown we already had some connections, but still more or less running things. But my wife and I wanted to look at life with even more open eyes. Especially since in our dreams and areas of work, wages are different here and there at times, and sometimes by almost 10 times. But it turns out that, moving to a major city and doing all the same things we can live with my wife, is very different from what we lived with her now. However, it didn't end up being as bright and colorful as she and I had imagined. She and I had small savings, which in this city would be enough for a year, or a little more. In general, look, Marina, the step that we decided to take. It is very serious. I suggested that she spend less, earn more, and save. While we are getting settled here, and getting accustomed, we decided that we will not have children yet. It doesn't take much time for that question, so once we're on our feet, I thought it wouldn't be an issue for sure. She agreed with me at the time, but not for long, as it turned out. As they say in the big city, the lights did their job, and I began to hear requests from her for trips to clubs, demands for entertainment, and expensive and inconsequential shopping and other trivial things. You and I had an agreement, but I did not get any intelligible answers from her. By the way, she also got a job and worked as a senior manager, helping to lead a line of work in one firm, albeit informally. I am telling you the details of her work for a reason. A few more months passed, and then came the first surprise. I walked into the room where she usually sits at her laptop in the evening and saw her on the social media page of the city. I asked her if she was interested in local news, and she replied that she was communicating with new people. It was that evening that I now consider as the beginning of our end. No one is forbidden to use social media, and I regret not paying attention to it that day. A couple more months passed, and my wife suddenly started having problems at work. As I mentioned, she was responsible for the undercarriage direction, albeit informally. She was delayed once, then twice, and then 3 times. I treated this with absolute calmness, because our main goal, as agreed with my wife, was our career and financial success. For this reason, I did not reprimand her for these delays until one random moment. As February 23rd approached, they were having a corporate party at the office. This story is not about the party itself, but about the fact that it sobered me up. Their firm was working that day, and in the evening they decided to get together and quickly congratulate all the men. That evening, my wife called me and asked me to pick her up. I agreed without question, and when I arrived, she said that her direct superior and his wife were there, and it would be good for us to get to know each other. We sat down and talked a little bit, and their boss turned out to be quite an interesting character. After their short corporate party, they suggested that we go to a restaurant nearby for an hour. He, his wife, and I were ready to go anywhere for food, so I agreed without question. We arrived and sat down for dinner. My wife doesn't drink and hasn't consumed anything today. Her boss offered her a drink, but since she doesn't drink and has the right to refuse, there was only one option for me and him. To make a long story short, we had a whiskey together. Then we went outside for a few minutes. The boss kept praising my wife, and I casually dropped a phrase. Everything seemed fine, but as usual, if you're not home for a long time due to work, you're not happy at home right away. But if you stay home too long, they're not happy either. I used to think this was only a problem for men, but it turns out my wife has the same issue. The boss asked me what I meant, and I explained that I was talking about her overwork. I was worried that I would start to become jealous and check up on her whereabouts and who she was with if she continued to work late. The boss was surprised and told me that they hadn't had any overtime in the last 2 months, and they still don't. They don't have such a heavy workload that they have to work day and night. Plus, my wife is a newcomer and has only been working for a short time, so she doesn't have a heavy workload. I felt embarrassed at that moment. This was the second time she had come home later than usual. Maybe it was inconvenient for the boss to explain himself to me. There may be overtime, but he doesn't mention it. Maybe it's time to ask my wife directly. We had dinner with them that day, and my wife, deep and night, drove us home. The next day, I started thinking about how I could find out where my wife was going. I asked her while she was at work, but when we met again in the kitchen that evening, I asked to see her phone so I could play something on YouTube. We ate dinner and watched the news on her phone. My wife put her plate in the sink and went into the other room. I quickly went through her calls and messages on her phone, but there was nothing there. Just a bunch of calls from unknown numbers, which must have been from work. She also had some messages from her friends in our hometown. I was tempted to block her phone, but her voice from the other room stopped me. She yelled out that she would have to go out again for work tomorrow or the next day and might be late for dinner. Of course, I could have started to tell her that I knew all about her non-existent overtime, but there was little evidence, if there was any evidence to speak of. I started going through everything she had on her phone, and that's where I discovered something I had to calculate for the next week. There were several rides on the list that were more expensive than all the available ones, and all of them were in the evening, from obscure addresses almost out of town, and all ending at our driveway. So Marina would go somewhere during the day, and from that place she would return to our house in the evening. I wrote down where the cab was called from, and realized it was time for me to go there myself. The next day, I got in my car and drove to the location in the evening. The fact that I drove in the evening was my mistake, but I didn't know about it at the time. I arrived at the spot where the cab picked up my wife every time, and I went outside, but it was an empty field. It was dark all around, with snow blowing in the wind. I made sure a couple of times, all right? I'm where my wife often is too. I got in the car and drove a little further. There were fields all around, so I turned on my high beams and used my navigator. The snow was getting deeper under my wheels. It was already starting to lightly creep around the bottom of my car. I saw the fence and the gate in the headlights, turned around and drove to the house. As I drove up, my wife called me. "Where are you?" she asked. "It's pretty late, and you're turning off your phone." "Who's turning it off?" I asked my wife again. "I'm on my way up the stairs." We had dinner, went to bed, and a couple of days later, she came home later than usual. I kept trying to figure out where she was going, so I took her cell phone again, and this time I couldn't believe my eyes. It was the same spot I had been to just a few days ago. Well, what do I have to go there again? I thought to myself, but I decided to go there before it got dark. Maybe I would see something. And I did see something on my way there. I went to the same place in the afternoon, but nothing had changed. It was still just an empty field. I used my navigator on my phone and took the same road. I came across another fence, but this one was too long and too high. I started to type the address into my phone to find out what kind of business it was, and then I saw that the network on my cell phone wasn't working at the fence. There were no bars at all. I backed up and turned around near the gate, and that's when I saw a sign. It was a prison. I turned around and drove a few dozen meters away, and the connection reappeared. I passed the point where my wife... Usually, I waited for a cab, and then it suddenly hit me that she had nowhere else to go. That's why she took a cab every time from this faraway point. In this varied establishment, it seems to be jammed, and there's no network reception, as you'd expect. I had already decided to go and show it to my wife, but she would not admit it so easily. If I don't get it right here, she'll make excuses for any of my arguments. Unless, of course, I'm wrong in my calculations and suspicions here. Anyway, I remembered that she said she was going to be late again the other day. I thought, here we go, we'll wait for that day. One day later, I called her cell phone in the afternoon, and it was out of range. It's now or never, I thought that day. I got in my car and drove to an address I already knew well. I called again on the way so I wouldn't accidentally go there for nothing, but the phone was still disconnected. It sounded like she was out there somewhere. I drove up and stood a little farther away where the gate lights didn't reach. I waited, and half an hour later, my wife actually came out. Like, a couple more people came out with her, apparently relatives of those sitting inside. They got into the car and drove away. Well, Marina went down that road to this place where there is still a connection. Apparently, she called a cab from there, as was her custom. I pulled up behind her, honked my horn, and she backed almost into the snowdrift. I took the left, stopped, and got out of the car. I shouted to her, "Hi, how are you here?" My wife and I, without waiting for her other pointless questions, told her that I knew about all her social networking activities, but also that there was and is no recycling. Of course, I had to lie a little and told her I had talked to a lawyer a few weeks ago. He had found everything for me and where she was going, and more importantly, found out to whom. So no excuses, let her not even think about it. I told her to just answer why she did all this, and whether it is not a shame to run like this quietly and in the evening to deceive me. Anyway, she met him on social networking sites. Apparently, he is also married and works in such a wonderful institution. I do not know what it was that attracted her to him. Perhaps a different attitude towards family values, because, as I understand it, he already has children. But I think that she will not find the same openness and understanding with him as she wanted with a comrade.